Good afternoon. Thank you. Wow. What a great audience, and thank you for choosing to spend your Sunday here with us. I promise you will not be disappointed. It is a real delight to welcome you on behalf of our Board of Trustees and the staff of the Nelson Atkins to a great occasion. For all of you who admire George Caleb Bingham, who depicted Missouri in such a great and straightforward way. It was 200 years ago that this world-renowned artist was born. So let me take you back to the point in time in which he was living. He was both, as you know, a politician but a great artist. And so he was there. It was a time where the fur traders established friendly relationships by offering beaver pellets to French explorers in exchange of kettles, knives, and other gifts. George Bingham recorded those traits on canvas, giving us the first account of what it was to live at the frontier at that time. How many of us understand the simple pleasures of fishing in the stream with the sun shining in our faces? Well, George Bingham put those peaceful, easy feelings on canvas for everyone to enjoy and feel like time suspended. And because he was involved in politics for most of his adult life, Bingham was able to create the complexity of political relations with grace and charm in his work. Not many politicians today have the time to paint, but wouldn't that be great? So we want really to take the time and honor this great artist's birthday in the most fitting way. So we're giving you all the opportunity to get to know him a bit better. We have displayed almost 30 drawings in the American galleries upstairs on the second floor that reveal intriguing insights into Bingham's artistic process as he developed composition from each of the canvases that you can then see in the galleries. So it's really an approach to his very detailed way of looking into different characters that he then recycles through his various paintings. But in just a few minutes, what you're going to witness here on stage is something that only the working together between the Kansas City Public Library and the Nelson Atkins we can do, is bring Bingham back to life. Amazing. And this is going to be an amazing way of celebrating his birthday, thanks to Crosby Kemper III, who will interview him for all of our delight. But also hope that you had the chance of listening to the Alfred Packard Memorial String Band in the Block building. Their music is joyous celebration of American folk and bluegrass, and they perform in a way that really transports you 200 years back. And because it is a birthday, of course there were birthday cupcakes, and I hope all of you had some. It will definitely keep that rush going through all this celebration. And then I want to take a moment to thank the Friends of Arrow Oak, Inc., who co-sponsored the programs this weekend. Thank you. The legendary series that you will see, Meet the Past, are a co-production and something that the Kansas City Public Library has been doing thanks to Crosby Kemper III. And in order to do that, we needed also additional support that has been generously provided by George Asby and Janet L. Richard Rees in honor of his wife, Janet. So thank you. But to add to these surprises and to add this great moment, we have a very distinguished honor today with us. We are honored to welcome someone who has long been an ardent supporter of the arts in Missouri. Our governor, Jay Nixon, and his lovely wife, Georgianne, wanted to show their appreciation and great admiration for the values expressed by George Bingham, and they're both here today with us. Thank you. So for someone who understands the arts and someone who clearly understands politics, it is a great pleasure that he is joining us today, offering some remarks. So please welcome to the podium our governor of the great state of Missouri, Jay Nixon. Thank you.
Thank you. Georgiana and I always look forward to our visits to Kansas City, but we're really especially delighted to be here at the Nelson Atkins to celebrate this 200th birthday of George Caleb Bingham. For those of you that have studied him and read him, his voice and his tongue and his eyes were such that they reflected our state in a very unique way. Julian, we thank you for your leadership here. The Nelson Atkins Board of Trustees, administration, and staff are organizing this entire weekend's events. Creative collaborations like this are what make Kansas City such a dynamic and vibrant community. Yes, 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 yes. The last time we were here was for another historic event, the opening of the museum's new American Indian galleries. There are masterpieces from many tribes and many eras, each with a powerful story to tell about the history and culture of our nation. I hope in this visit and others you will take the time and opportunity to visit them. Now, today's bicentennial exhibition and events are one of the highlights of a statewide Bingham celebration that includes the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum of Independence, the Kansas City Public Library, and the Friends of Arrow Rock. With support from the Friends of Arrow Rock, our State Historical Society will soon publish a new collection of Bingham's letters. Now, George Caleb Bingham had two great passions in life, painting and democracy. Neither one is a spectator sport. Now, Bingham, a self-taught painter, followed the prime directive of paint what you know. And what he knew, backwards and forwards, was the state of Missouri and its people. He knew Missouri well, and he wanted to make a difference for this state both as an artist and as a politician. Bingham not only was a great artist from the state of Missouri, he was a great artist of the state of Missouri. Everywhere he lived, and he lived just about everywhere, Arrow Rock, Booneville, Independence, Kansas City, Columbia, St. Louis, Jefferson City, he painted what he saw in his daily life. What he saw was the breaching and transformation of the American frontier. Traders and trappers, settlers and slaves, jolly boatmen, dour Indians, and overstuffed politicians. Hoping that wasn't a laugh line, but I was trying to work my way right on through it, you know. I'll try not to jump off the script here, I'm sorry. He painted them all as they traveled the great arteries of transcontinental commerce as they opened by Lewis and Clark, and only a few years before Bingham himself was born. Imagine a world before YouTube, before TV, before motion pictures, before much still photography. Painting was a powerful and immediate form of communication. And Bingham wielded his paintbrush with a documentarian's eye for detail and a director's sense of drama. He brought a first-hand view of the rough-hewn culture of Missouri to a wider world of East Coast elites and Europeans with boundless curiosity about the mythic American West. Like many artists of his day, Bingham painted portraits to earn a living, including full-size paintings of Presidents Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson that unfortunately were lost in the fire that destroyed our state capitol in 1911. But unlike any artist of the day, he made his other passion, democracy, one of his greatest subjects. No other American painter, then or since, made the democratic process such an important part of his work. Bingham painted American politics in action, its pettiness and pride, on full display in paintings like Canvassing for a Vote and Stump Speaking, which are part of this exhibition. If you look closely, you might see some familiar characters in the crowds. But in the end, these paintings are a celebration of a boisterous young nation and that work in progress we call democracy. Now, as a political figure, Bingham was outspoken, argumentative, and opinionated. I know a few others like that. He wrote countless letters to the editor, and he was prone to swimming against the current, even when his own party of Whigs. But his passion for democracy and his love for Missouri compelled him to follow a life in and out of politics. During his years of public service as state treasurer, legislator, president of the Kansas City Board of Police Commissioners, and adjutant general, Bingham was called upon to deal with many of the thorniest issues related to a post-Civil War reconstruction in the Show-Me State. One of his most famous and polemic paintings, Order Number 11, depicts the forced evacuation of all non-unionist residents of Bates, Cass, Jackson, and Vernon counties, and the burning of their homes and possessions. Bingham called the order, issued by Union General Thomas Ewing, imbecilic, and Bingham was on the Union side. He ended his career as the first professor of art at the University of Missouri with the help of his old friend and patron, James S. Rollins. Bingham's paintings capture Missouri's restless frontier spirit with an immediacy and authenticity that galvanized his contemporaries and still captivates us today. I have a feeling if George were here today, we'd spend the rest of the afternoon swapping fishing stories and arguing about the state of Missouri politics. But I think he'd be gratified to know that our fractious, flawed democracy, tested and torn by civil war, has endured. And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from our earth. Happy birthday, Mr. Bingham.
Thank you, Governor Nixon, and thank you, Mrs. Nixon, for joining us this afternoon. I'm Margie Conrad, Curator of American Art here at the Nelson, and it's my pleasure to add to all of Julian's welcomes and also to introduce this afternoon's programs. We are very grateful to the Friends of Arrow Rock for co-sponsoring our weekend celebration, and I also just want to mention that on April 2nd in Arrow Rock, they're having a marvelous symposium dedicated to George Caleb Bingham, of which I will be making a presentation, as well as some of my colleagues from the State Historical Society. So we hope you will join us there as well. We are also very appreciative of our partners for today, the Kansas City Public Library, with whom we partner often and always have a marvelous time doing it. And we will be, as Julian said, having the opportunity to meet Mr. Bingham this afternoon, along with his interviewer, Crosby Kemper. And so I'd like to now introduce Henry Fortunato from the Kansas City Public Library, who will set the stage for our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Margie. I know just what you wanted. Yet another introductory speaker. And to think there are 17 more to go. And then each of you will be given an opportunity to speak as well. Which means at this rate, the event will begin around 6 p.m. Pacific time. I promise I will be very brief. My job is to simply set the stage for what's about to happen. The primary premise of Meet the Past is based on an eminently absurd, yet weirdly logical proposition. And that is, if anybody of consequence in the history of Kansas City came back from the dead, the first thing they'd want to do is engage in a TV talk show style conversation with everyone's favorite librarian. I mean, wouldn't you? The secondary premise, which I hasten to add was not part of the original idea, but instead just sort of happened organically, was that during the process of this conversation, my dear friend and esteemed colleague would demonstrate conclusively that the Kemper clan and therefore CK3 himself, is indelibly connected to, well, just about anyone who has made their mark on Kansas City. With any Chambers, we had to do a bit of work. That will also be the case with George Caleb Bingham. It's going to be a bit of a stretch since the Kempers had not arrived in this part of the country by the 1850s. But where there's a Kemper, there's a connection. Watch carefully how he manages to slip this one in. So, time to begin. For those of you who've never experienced one of these things before, be advised that this presentation has not been scripted or rehearsed. Both of our performers have done extensive research on George Caleb Bingham, and they have a general idea of what they're going to talk about, but what you're going to experience is largely extemporaneous, ad hoc. In other words, an advanced version of make it up as you go along. Sort of how we do almost everything in my area of the library. Portraying George Caleb Bingham is veteran Kansas City-based actor Robert Gibby Brand, who has gained renown as the lead player in numerous productions by the Metropolitan Ensemble Theater. Bob also did a star turn as Edgar Snow in the library's most recent edition of Meet the Past back in October, after which he told me he'd never do one of these things again. But such is the enduring significance of George Caleb Bingham that when we suggested this role to Bob, he readily admitted it was an offer he could not refuse. In what may be a far more challenging role, Crosby Kemper III plays Crosby Kemper III. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Crosby Kemper.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Margie, I hope it's okay. I couldn't bring the portrait from the library, so I just took this one off the wall upstairs. I hope that's okay. And Governor, it's an honor to be here with you. This intersection of politics and art may not be pretty, but it will be enlightening. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce to you the man who was known as the Missouri artist in his lifetime, and he became iconically American. I want to introduce him on today, his 200th birthday, ladies and gentlemen, George Caleb Bingham. Well, happy birthday, Mr. Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Kemper.
Now,
Our honored guest, by any chance, is he a Whig?
well, there are no more wigs, Mr. Bingham, except perhaps for the one you're wearing. He did actually wear a wig.
After 1854, of course, I ceased to be a Whig myself and generally associated myself with the more liberal wing of the Republicans.
The liberal Republicans no longer exist either, Mr. Bingham.
You don't mean to tell me they're liberal Democrats?
I will have to discuss that later with the governor. Now, Mr. Bingham, you played an important role in the Civil War and painted one of the most evocative and controversial moments in our history. Your painting, Order Number 11, I've just pulled up here. It's behind you. A little bit bigger, actually, than maybe you painted it. But you were a Union man, as the governor told us earlier. Had a great position in the state government, and were captain of militia. Tell us how you came to paint this picture.
I'll try to reduce this rather extensive story to a brief account. I was Secretary of the Treasury of Missouri after Hamilton Gamble, who was at that time the governor, appointed me. It was a rather frustrating job. The state's finances were in total chaos, and we were attempting to...
That sounds familiar.
And nor was our temporary government able to control the federal troops which had been stationed here. Remember, this is the middle of the war. Now, the address was 1425 Grand in Kansas City.
Which is roughly where the Sprint Arena is, but of course you wouldn't know that, but just to place it for everyone.
People run, I suppose. Yes, this is serious now.
Your studio.
My studio, actually it was my father-in-law's house, Reverend Thomas, and we had
Later
built...
president of William Jewell.
Invaluable. Little studio on the 3rd floor I had built. Now, when I was made the treasurer of the state, I took my family and we moved up to Jefferson City for the extent during the war. During this time, the house was requisitioned by the Union troops.
General Ewing.
Yes, exactly. And as you, I'm sure, as all good Missourians know about the raids of Quantrill and Bill Anderson and what they had been doing, Colonel Doc Jennison, who I already had been trying to point the finger at and hoped that they would try to have him arrested, but...
it was Jennison's Jayhawkers. He invented the Jayhawkers.
That's right.
And he attacked Harrisonville.
Mm-hmm. He did, and a bloody business it was indeed. Ewing's idea was that perhaps if he couldn't control these rabble-rousers militarily, perhaps he could influence them by arresting the mothers, sisters, and daughters of these men.
Order number 10.
Exactly. And into this house, that was mine at 1425 Grand, he placed 11 women, 2 of whom I know were sisters of Bloody Bill Anderson.
Who rode with Quantrill?
Yes, and Quantrill's relatives. This was an appalling situation in the first place. Why are we persecuting civilian women, after all? But who am I to question what is going to go on during wartime? So on August 13th, the building collapsed, killing 5 of those women, injuring all of them. This, of course, was a tremendous scandal, an appalling situation. This raised tremendous rage amongst the desperados under Quantrill and Anderson, and it was one of the spurs which then led on the 21st of August to the massacre in Lawrence. And
I know, shouted, "Remember the women."
Yes, exactly. And I know this to be a fact because my next wife, Maddie Likens, whom I would marry in 78.
Your 3rd wife, Mr. Bingham.
Well, who can have too much of feminine companionship? She happened to be paying a visit in Lawrence during the raid, and she heard many of these men actually say, "Remember the women of Kansas City." And following this appalling atrocity, General Thomas Ewing issued his order number 11 on the 25th of August, which, as your governor has mentioned, caused a tremendous depopulation of the area in Jackson, Cass, Bates, and half of Vernon County. And many of them fled by foot and wagon all the way to Lexington, 28 miles away, blazing heat. Their fields had been burned, their crops were taken or requisitioned, and many of the houses were destroyed.
And so you wrote letters, you made speeches, even though you were an officer yourself of the Union government, the Constitutional Union Party government of the state of Missouri, attacking the Union forces for Jennison's depredations, for Ewing's orders, for the taking of property, and for the death of these women. And what happened?
It was an appalling violation of civil liberties. Nothing happened.
And so at the end of the war,
I decided I would make him infamous, this gentleman, by both brush and pen, and swore that I would try to do that. This painting was designed, and I painted 2 copies of it, was to be engraved, and I had it published and sent forth with a copy of Order Number 11 and a statement concerning my intentions behind it, which was try to remind all citizens after the war the value of civil liberties, which theoretically we had fought for, and what was turning into a justification for the most appalling brutality and settling of old recounts. Well, if the painting perhaps is more propaganda than art, and I freely admit that, and I felt so strongly about the necessity of insisting upon the civil liberties of these people. This was vital.
In fact, you entitled the engraving "Dedicated to the Friends of Civil Liberty." Well, and you continued to go after Ewing in his political career after the Civil War. He went back to Ohio. He was a brother-in-law of General Sherman. He ran for Congress. He ran for governor. You continued until really your last days to send copies of the engraving to Ohio and write letters to the editor.
One could never have enough of a good thing. My son was always marveling that I was insisting on taking a pen and complaining about this man, but I felt that justice had never been done, and I felt that Ohioans must understand what his history was. And people always seemed to be overlooking anything that was done in terms of the war was clearly, we would turn a blind eye to that event.
Well, I want to take you back. This
encouraged me to go upstairs and sit with Mr. Harding and see if there was anything he needed for a refreshment or a help. And I was fascinated by what I saw. I'd never seen a man doing this before. And here were paints and canvas and brushes, and he seemed to be completely focused and was very generous towards me. I never forgot the incident. I was only 9 years old, but it was an unforgettable moment. And it impressed itself on my mind, and I thought, is it really possible to take paints that we see splashed on a barn door and these little coarse brushes and create something that people want to look at? Not only record their faces, but events, stories, record the world. So, with my own stubbornness and foolishness, perhaps, I went ahead after leaving Justinian Williams. At first I thought maybe I might become a minister, maybe I might become a lawyer. I had the gift of the gab, as you can see, as my mouth is running away with me.
Politics was a choice that made some sense for you.
Indeed.
Now, you begin painting these portraits for folks in the neighborhood, and almost immediately the Missouri Intelligencer calls you an undoubted genius, even though you'd never seen a portrait painted. You're the meteor of art. They call you, and one of your most important early paintings is Dr. Sappington.
Now, Dr. Sappington, by this time we had moved to Arrow Rock. You have to remember that Franklin was washed away in 1825 by a shift in the current on the Missouri River, and my mother, fortunately, had moved us over to Arrow Rock on the other side, high up on the bluffs. So we had established ourselves in this little community, and one of the primary figures there was Dr. Sappington, who'd made a fortune in quinine and study of fevers, and his remarkable wife, Jane Braithwaite.
He discovered the use of quinine for malaria.
That's right, and made a great deal of money off it. And they were striking individuals. They were also prodigiously prolific. They had 9 children, and I first painted them in 1834. If you were to compare the two paintings, this is 1844, I think I had made some small degree of improvement in my technical skills at that point. But they were fierce.
You mentioned his being prolific. His daughters, 3 of his daughters married one man who became important in your life, in the life of Missouri, predecessor of our governor, Claiborne Fox Jackson,
exactly.
Who married not 1, not 2, but 3 of Dr. Sappington's daughters.
Exactly.
And when he came for the 3rd daughter,
Dr. Sappington said, "You can have another daughter if you wish, but I'll be damned if you can have Mrs. Sappington."
So you started your career with virtually no professional training. So you take off for Philadelphia, St. Louis, New York. The National Academy takes 6 pictures of yours in 1840.
That's right.
But you're also at the same time one of the most important things you painted in 1840 was a banner for William Henry Harrison.
Yes, absolutely. The Whig Party, which you may not remember or recall, was essentially an anti-Jacksonian party, and they were attempting to resist the very powerful democratic institution was in place at the time, and they were very much in favor of tariff and strong federal government, and please, let's do something about the riverways and the railroads and the waters to make sure that they're federally supported so that we could keep them open and clean. And some of the government felt that this should be a state institution and not a federally based one, so there was much argument to that effect. And my friend, James Sidney Rollins, who I believe was mentioned before, was a founder of the Whig Party in Columbia at that time, and he felt that I should get involved with this, and I painted banners for William Henry Harrison, and we were so enthusiastic. 80% of the electorate voted that year. Can you imagine 80% of the electorate voted? And Van Buren was defeated, and William Henry Harrison was carried, and by heavens, we even had a larger quantity in the Congress. So the Whigs were suddenly very much in power. And I thought, well, let's take my family, and I've been supportive of the Whig movement. Perhaps they will then look favorably upon a Whig painter. And I opened a little studio in the basement of the then newly built Capitol.
Now, wait just a second. Your studio was in the Capitol building?
That's right, in the basement.
Governor, as you downsize the state of Missouri, oops, the governor's gone. Well, as the governor downsizes the state of Missouri, perhaps he could find some space in the Capitol for artists today.
Why not? Absolutely. What better place?
So one gentle way of supporting the arts. So tell us the story. There's a story about you and John Quincy Adams, who was in Congress after having been president.
The advantage, of course, of having a studio in the basement of the Capitol was that the various senators and representatives would drift down there. It was a long, hot... See, I was there for 4 years, and they would be curious, what's the strange man doing down there? And one day, a gentleman came in. I was working on a canvas at the time, and he paused and looked at what I was doing, and then this little voice, dry as autumn leaves, said, you know, there was a woman in the Bible who painted. And I paused for a moment and said, yes, 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 30, and Jezebel painted her eyes, and she looked out the tower, and Jehu had her thrown down, and her body was devoured by dogs. Thus began my friendship with John Quincy Adams.
And so your painting of Adams became well known, and you displayed it in Washington and in St. Louis. In St. Louis, you displayed it with a portrait you've done of David Rice Atchison of Clay County fame, who became, it was kind of a foreshadowing of the Civil War, I think, that Atchison, you should have Atchison and Adams portraits displayed together.
One pro and one very anti-slavery.
Exactly. You wrote your future wife a letter on November 30th, 1835.
This was Sarah Elizabeth Hutchison.
And you said, very few are aware of the mortifications and anxieties which attend the work of a painter, and of the toil and study which it requires to give him success and raise him to distinction. Nearly 3 years have elapsed, and I have scarcely learned to paint the human face, after having accomplished which I shall have ascended but one step toward the eminence to which the art of painting may be carried. It's interesting to me, this letter was written on November 30th, 1835. I wonder if you know why that date is so important in Missouri's history. It's the birth of Mark Twain, who is the other great limner of the rivers of Missouri, Huck Finn. So you've become a great portrait painter at this point, but the great moment of your art is about to arrive. As you paint fur traders descending the Missouri, and then the Jolly Flatboatmen, and you become the iconic painter of the rivers of Missouri, the rivers of America. You submit these works to the American Art Union.
And it was because of their support that, in many ways, this is what encouraged me to go into what was called genre painting. Now, the American Art Union was an organization, if you paid your $5 annual fee, which then went to a large communal pot, and there was an executive committee to whom we submitted our paintings. They then selected a certain number, one or two of which was then raffled off by lottery to as many. At one point, the union had 10,000 members, and this was a way of obtaining some publicity, financial remuneration, of course, and if you were fortunate enough, possibly they engraved your painting. So this was a wonderful way of having your work distributed in a much wider way than if you simply sold individual works. But a word about genre painting. Why did I feel impelled to move in this direction, aside from the fact that this seemed to be the fashion that the union was encouraging? When I had gone to Philadelphia in 1838, I saw some of the paintings of William Sidney Mount and also the Scotsman Sir David Wilkie. And they, somewhat earlier, had been exploring this idea of depicting rural or smaller communities in action, and I thought, why not capture capture the spirit of what I had come from, because I knew there were so many fascinating things. People would talk to me about what was it like to live on the wild prairie. Of course, they imagined buffalo and Osage Indians pounding at the door all the time. And when you described to them it was essentially a very middle-class, well-behaved society, they were always disappointed. But this remarkable painting, which we now refer to as the fur trader descending the Missouri, was originally the French trapper and his half-breed son. Excuse me if I stand up here for a moment. I don't know if you can see on this remarkable magic lantern reproduction we have here. You see, there's the boy with his little duck that he has shot, and he is very specifically leaning on a deer skin, which is marked with specific Indian hieroglyphics, and there's a beaded bag and so forth. People often said, what in heaven's name was this, a cat doing out there? And I said, no. At the time, and I may have made the ears a little too pointed. I painted this picture again at a second time and modified that. People were so puzzled. Many of the trappers would take bear cubs. They had often shot the mother, of course, both for protection and food and the coats and all the rest of it. And so they would keep the little ones on the edge of their boats. This was not that unusual. So this, in fact, is a little bear cub.
You have a French fur trader, the Chouteaus, the founders of Missouri, both St. Louis and Kansas City. You have the half-breed son, the Chouteaus, intermarried with Osage.
That's
also
right.
with French women, depending on where they were at the time. And then the bear cub, there are bears on the state seal of Missouri. Yeah, so this painting, which had national resonance, and which now is said to be the most popular painting in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, also is full of local resonance as well. But you had great success. You then painted, and it's one of the most popular paintings in American history, and was the most popular painting the American Art Union had, the Jolly Flatboat.
That's right, exactly. Now, I often get criticized because of they said, well, why do you use such obvious patterns? You can see here, obviously, the triangle. You will see the triangle again and again in my works. When you've been self-taught, you tend to gravitate toward elements that are going to appeal to your own sense of form. And I had no master telling me. I had learned from books and from studying other people's paintings. I don't know if you could recognize this particular pattern, but it was actually somewhat inspired by a painting of Raphael's, The Ascension of Christ. I like the whole sense of the energy of the body floating in air. So I used it for our dancer here. And it gives a sense of delight and joy and energy and enthusiasm. And then we have the challenge, of course, of this young man gazing out at you, sort of engaging you and saying, well, what do you think? And then you can't see it so well probably in the reproduction, but if you were able to see the painting itself, the details of what they are carrying underneath in the lower half of the flatboat is quite specific. There's the raccoon skin as well, and they are journeying down the river. And the river, of course, is beginning to become lost in a sort of haze. All right, fine, I'm learning to paint my own sense of a landscape. This is good, my skill is improving. But there's also the feeling of, if you look at it in a broader sense, where is America going? And how are we progressing? And are we going up the river, down the river?
America's going into the mist, Mr. Bingham?
Exactly.
Downriver. Well, so you paint this, it becomes a very popular engraving. Currier and Ives reproduces it more than once. And as you say, there's this placid, beautiful river scene. At the same time, your life is less than placid. 1844, 1845, you come back from Washington, and by the way, also from Petersburg, Virginia, which you had visited, where you had visited the old family friend, Dr. George Kemper. And in 1846, having just painted these paintings, and your art career is taking off, you run for the state legislature against
Erasmus Darwin Sappington, one of those 9 offspring of Dr. Sappington whom you saw before.
And you win!
By 3 votes.
3 votes.
And I was installed in my seat by committee, as was correct. But Sappington was insistent that this was a false situation and wanted to have the whole position challenged. Now, I said, very well. I wrote to him and I said, let's put it back up to a vote to the common people. I'm happy to do that. He refused to do that. He hired himself a lawyer, Stringfellow, and challenged the whole situation.
Who was the Attorney General of the state of Missouri at the time.
You're honoring him with maybe more than he deserves. And he knew that if it was brought before a vote in the General House, that the Democrats far outweighed the Whigs and that I would lose. And indeed I did. And I suspect, rather wet behind the ears and naive at the machinations of how politics worked at the time. And this was a good lesson for me. I did retreat from this whole political business somewhat singed. And I remember writing to Rollins, well, I'll simply have to strip off my suit, bury it in the earth, scour myself from head to foot with water and sand, and reject politics for the rest of my life.
Now wait, you're telling me that the election was stolen from you in Missouri?
It was stolen, but it was manipulated in such a way that I had not a chance of possibly retrieving that seat. But
you continued to paint.
I did continue to paint.
And the next great painting you painted was the lighter relieving a steamboat.
Exactly.
Aground. And this is there's an interesting aspect to this. First, let me tell you, this is hanging in the White House today, Mr. Bingham.
Really?
Yes, and hanging in the green room of the White House. Yes.
I hope it doesn't augur ill for the ship of state, since the poor thing has run aground. But
well, it may have occurred to President Obama when he was looking at it this week.
Again, let me point, you see the structure of it and the sense of the journey forward. But there was also an element that was coming into play. Now, President Polk at that time had won against Henry Clay, my great Whig hero. And one of the things, as I mentioned before, we wanted to have something done about the waterways. They were constantly being clogged, and it was a very difficult time for transportation. So I rather only slightly suggested it here, but as you can see, this is clearly run around on a sandbar, and here are some of the projecting sawyers and branches that were often in the middle of the Missouri. These became known as poke stalks at the time, blaming the president for not having them cleared. But it works well, I think, as a painting.
And it's interesting that politics, the union of politics and art, James Yateman, who was the greatest banker in the state of Missouri at the time, the founder of the Mercantile Library, the first continuously operated library west of the Mississippi, and the founder of the Whig Party, one of the founders of the Whig Party in Missouri, on his way, as he was about to go to a Chicago Rivers and Harbors Convention to attack President Polk for continuing to veto the Rivers and Harbors Bill, bought this painting from you, which has ended up in the White House. So then, the election of 1848, and you run for the legislature again.
And this time I won by 30 votes. And even Sappington didn't want to challenge at that time.
So you're in the legislature.
Oh, if I'd known.
Whig member of the legislature. Fortunately, the governor's gone. You at the same time you travel. You're traveling to Philadelphia. You travel again to New York, and in New York, I believe you're in New York. While you're sitting in the legislature, you're in New York painting this picture. What is this picture, Mr. Bingham?
This is Daniel Boone leading, actually, his family through the wilderness, as we then refer to it. It's a great change from both the genre painting, obviously, and the portrait painting. It was not purchased by the American Art Union. I suspect it was not what they considered fashionable. But I was curious, because there was a movement in Europe, and as well as in Washington. How are we going to depict larger scenes? In 1851, Emanuel Leutze painted his very famous Washington crossing the Delaware. I made an attempt at that myself, not so successfully. But I was wanting to paint something that was going to capture our sense of history. It has a sense of epic, of drama to it. And so I moved a little further afield than I had before. Remember, Boone had died in 1820, so this is depicting something entirely fictitious, at least in terms of what I actually saw. But we have his wife, Rebecca and daughter Jemima, very possibly Morgan, Daniel Boone here, and I'm struck by the fact that I like the little detail which modifies again my ever-present triangle.
Well, and isn't this a feature of your history painting and your political painting, that you take this magnificent, this noble, this monumental subject, Daniel Boone coming through the Cumberland Gap, opening up the West, a Madonna-like figure in Rebecca, the grand, the noble, Raphael-like portrait, and then all of a sudden there's this guy tying his shoe with the dog. And it makes it a very democratic form of art, it seems to me.
Oh, he means that in the best sense of the word.
Yeah, so with a small d, sorry.
No loco-focoism here.
No loco. But as you said, that there's a change as you go monumental and are starting to paint these iconic paintings. There's a turn on you in New York, the New York literary world. The New York literary world, I just love that. Refers to your painting as vulgar. And the American Art Union, in their journal, someone writes an article in which he says that this is the death of high art. These figures like the man tying his shoe and the dogs and the bear cubs and so.
Prejudice finds its way into all kinds of circumstances, doesn't it? It's remarkable. I was all set to sue, actually, for defamation, feeling that these people didn't know what they were talking about. But I didn't have to do anything about it, because in 1851, the American Art Union had to be dissolved, because it turned out that after all these years of holding a lottery, they were they were breaking the law in New York. The lottery itself was illegal, and so they had to dissolve very rapidly indeed. This meant that I had to find another way then of publicizing my own paintings. And what's next? Oh yes, we begin to go into politics.
And so you begin, and we're talking about 1850 and 1851. You've been in the legislature, and there's a big change as the Compromise of 1850 is passed with slavery, admitting slave states in the South, admitting California and Maine as free states. And the debate over slavery gets underway in a major way, and there's a big shift in Missouri politics because Thomas Hart Benton, who had been one of your enemies, the enemy of Henry Clay, takes the position that slavery should be banned in the territories. Exactly. And destroys the Democratic Party, bitterly divides the Democratic Party in Missouri over that. And so you begin to paint political paintings. This is called Canvassing for a Vote, is here in the Nelson. And it's said that the central figure there, the somewhat smiling, largish man, is Marmaduke, one of the sons-in-law of Sappington.
Another one.
Lieutenant governor of Missouri, son becomes governor, etc.
But I hesitate to say that was a portrait, because I feel that the paintings, even though these are about American scenes, and it's very easy to point and say, oh, he must have meant so-and-so, that surely is a deliberate piece of satire. And I did not want to paint merely satire. Hogarth did that, and I give him full tribute to the kind of brilliant indictment of political corruption he was painting in the 18th century in England. But I wanted to paint something a little more universal. Although it has its element of criticism, there's no question. The gentleman in the middle could also be a jolly innkeeper. We're at an inn. We have our politician here with his battered hat making the gesture warning. This could be in reference to what Mr. Kemper referred to, the Wilmot Proviso, which was, of course, urging that the Congress decide what state was going to be slavery and not. We have a wealthy farmer here who's listening, and a laborer behind also, and the little fellow behind him peering into the tavern wanting to have his drink, I suspect. If you could tell, perhaps you can't from the magic lantern, that this shape is actually the backside of a horse behind the politician.
Did you mean that to be a
Draw
commentary?
what conclusion you will. We also have our little sleeping dog here. Now, a sleeping dog is common enough in a country road where you don't have an awful lot of traffic going on, but it might also suggest the possibility of the sleeping dog of slavery that was going on, the sleeping dog of social unrest that may be happening. So, you can make your own conclusions.
And so this is a moment, it's so interesting to me that this moment when the country, and particularly Missouri and Kansas, are about to be embroiled in civil unrest, that you paint this placid painting of politics being conversationally dealt with, and the sleeping dog seems about to awake, you're in the legislature. You're very engaged in this as well. Claiborne Fox Jackson, who eventually becomes governor at the beginning of the Civil War, in the legislature proposes something called the Jackson resolutions, right, which would exclude, announces that it would allow for squatter sovereignty, what eventually became the position of Douglas, Senator Douglas, that each state should be allowed to decide its own way on slavery. And you proposed the Bingham resolutions,
which was in contradistinction to that, and we were hoping that the Congress would maintain control over the decision on slavery, but we included the clause with sensitivity to what each regional area needed to survive. And we understood, after all, that slavery, although a moral abomination, was still very much part of the economic structure of these things, of the country. And it had to be dealt with a certain degree of sensitivity, because it wasn't just being maintained for the sake of sheer savagery. Now, what we're looking at, yes, we have a county election.
And what was important to you at this time was the Constitution and the Union.
And maintaining the Union.
You said that slavery was out of harmony with the principles of the Declaration, but where were you on the subject of abolition? Where were you on the subject of secession?
By 1856, I had released what few slaves remained. We had brought some with us.
So you were a slave
owner?
owner?
Of course we were. My mother had slaves. How else was she going to run a tobacco farm in the 1830s? But we did, and I became more and more aware that this was a terrible thing to have. And I wrote a number of letters for the Missouri Statesman, for my editor friend William Switzler, passionately renouncing slavery by 1856. So one finds one's positions growing and modifying, and you realize that something you had thought of as a necessity, you begin to see as something that has to change and must change somehow. But the question was how, of course. So we always say in America that election, the voice of the people must be heard. So why not depict
the county election?
Exactly, the election. Now, you will notice that we do have a gentleman of color here who is serving cider to a gentleman who may have had more than his share. And then the eye progresses. We find two fellows holding one up, who's clearly passed out from unfortunate inebriation, but he's going to be dragged up to give his vote nonetheless. Little boys playing Mumble the Peg down here, completely oblivious of what's going on. We move forward further up the line, again with a sort of diagonal sweep. We find, oh, wow, who's this gentleman? It could be the great Mr. Sappington himself, well, I'm not sure, tipping his hat and offering possibly, well, it could be
a bribe,
a drink on me, or a vote for me. It could be any number of things. And here's the gentleman actually taking the oath, making his vote, which you did verbally at that time, so everyone knew how you stood. And there was the judge, of course, receiving that information and discussion. And here's an odd little fellow sitting here sketching away the whole scene. I don't know who he might be.
So, some people think that this might be Arrow Rock, of course, with the people being lifted to the polls. It could be Jackson County. You said at one point this could be the most populous precinct of Buncombe. And yet, it's also said that you also said that you were trying to paint the manners of a free people. I wonder if you could tell us what it says on the banner up there.
Heavens. What was it exactly? And I can't see it from the reproduction, but it was the will of the people is to be heard.
The will of the people is the supreme law.
Supreme law.
Salus populi est suprema lex.
That's right.
Which is the motto of the state of Missouri. And here you are saying to us that this is democracy?
So didn't I hear the governor say that it was a flawed system, but one that we have to cling to? And where if people don't exercise their rights, how are they going to have their voice heard? So regardless of the problems and the weaknesses of it, we have to try to stick to it to maintain the sense of unity as a people, and that the voice of the people must be heard nonetheless.
And about the same time you're painting this picture, a Frenchman who visited America to investigate democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville,
before my time,
who made it all the way to the border of Missouri. In his second volume, a little bit darker volume than the first, he deals with the paradox that you deal with in this painting. He says, to seek the reason of things for oneself is the goal of Americans. Each American appeals to the individual exercise of his own understanding alone as a source of truth, the standard of judgment, and feels that nothing transcends the limits of understanding. But the paradox is that the majority, the parties, the Democrats or the Whigs, the Republicans and the Democrats later, are supplying the multitude with ready-made opinions, lifting the drunk up to vote, for instance, and it checks and retards the energy of the individual, and as you say, a new dress for servitude. Can this paradox be resolved? Does it have to end up in civil war?
It did in our case, yes. There was no question. But I like what you said, de Tocqueville's emphasis upon the individual and the greater opening of oneself to your highest capacities. That's our responsibility as people and as citizens.
Well, and that's what you tried in your painting, it seems to me, to lift us to. As the Civil War was coming on, you sought for commissions from both the federal government and from the state government, successfully from the state government, to do portraits of Washington and Jefferson and Clay and Jackson to paint the enduring heroes, the representatives, the preeminent representatives of the great American nation, the brave and heroic statesmen, as your friend Switzler said. And so you did, but you went off to Germany to do this.
To France first. The state legislature had given me $3,500, which at that time was a very large sum, and I took Eliza Thomas, my second wife, and Clara, my daughter by my first, and we went to Paris, which was not particularly encouraging. There was an engraving company named Goupil who was supposed to provide me with a salubrious studio and get the engraving work done on some of the paintings I wanted, neither of which were accomplished. So I was advised by friends to move on to Düsseldorf, where the Königliche Kunstakademie, the Royal Art Academy, was being maintained, and a primary star there was Emanuel Leutzer, whom I mentioned before as having painted the Washington crossing the Delaware. And he very kindly found me a superb studio where I was able to complete these oversized paintings of Washington and Jefferson.
And there's a large colony of American artists.
Exactly.
There was a number of them there. In Düsseldorf.
And it was a very, very positive experience. Some of my critics later in life felt that perhaps the exposure to German academic work may have staled my work. I felt that perhaps my technique improved. But these questions of aesthetics become highly subjective. I certainly continue to paint. But as you said, the Civil War is about to happen, and it would seem inappropriate to continue painting portraits or anything else with all...
And your constant enemy and near neighbor, Claiborne Fox Jackson, becomes governor of Missouri as the Civil War breaks out. On January 3rd, 1861, after South Carolina has already declared for secession, he gives a speech in the legislature in favor of Missouri's secession from the Union. And on January 8th, 5 days later, you deliver, on the anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, your portrait of Andrew Jackson.
And Henry Clay. And all I was asked to do was make a simple dedicatory speech. Well, of course, I didn't. The impulse was too great. The country was obviously about to fall into an appalling cataclysm, and I felt that it was essential to say something to this body, and I passionately stated the need for union and liberty and freedom, and I quoted from Washington and a number of other sources. I also highly criticized many of the members of the representation of Missouri as being traitors, and this did not go over well. And in fact, they were going to deny me the right to hang the paintings, and I said, very well, I'll take them to St. Louis and put them on display there. But I had to say what I said. My wife was always saying to me that I was invariably talking faster than my brain would work, and that was probably one of those major occasions.
And the portrait of Jackson is under a banner that is the saying that is what he said during the nullification crisis in the 1830s. The Union, it must be preserved, a line that you used frequently. The Lieutenant Governor Reynolds said he thought you were levying war against your patron, the state, and that maybe you shouldn't be paid.
Mm-hmm. As I said, I was going to take the paintings away.
So the Civil War comes.
Indeed it does.
Indeed
it does. And I enlisted right away as a private, and then I found myself elected as a captain of Company C of Van Horn's Kansas City regulars militia. And I spent 9 months struggling to build up a home guard, which was a heavy and wearisome business indeed. And it was a very frustrating one. And I was very grateful when the new governor, Hamilton, gambled because Claiborne Fox Jackson had fled to Arkansas, claiming, and took the Missouri state seal with him, as a matter of fact, insisting that he was then running the country from Arkansas. He was that kind of a gentleman. Gamble offered me the position of state secretary, and this is where we came in.
State treasurer.
As treasurer, yes, treasurer. This is where we came in.
Yeah, exactly. So you're state treasurer, but your attempt politically is to continue arguing for reconciliation,
mm-hmm.
for not to, as you said, you're a member of the great conservative party in opposition to the destruction of the radicals, whichever side the radicals on, whether it's secessionists or abolitionists. And you also said, I love this line, the times require a man who has enemies. That perhaps is always true in politics when you're standing on principle. The Civil War ends, and you paint Order Number 11. You're in constant demand as a painter, but also your political career. You're constantly being talked about for Congress, mm-hmm. for governor. But you do actually take a position in Kansas City. You're mm-hmm. appointed by the governor.
I'm the commissioner of police. The board.
President of the board of the police commission.
We were anxious to control the gambling that was going on in the city. And as a teetotaler, of course, I was also interested in seeing if we could modify the drinking, neither of which happened.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're a teetotaler, even though you paint the salubrious effects of drink in so many of your paintings. You become the adjutant general of the state of Missouri as well.
People were feeling, particularly in this area, that the federal government must be held responsible in making some sort of reparation for the loss of property. Remember, what we depicted in Order Number 11 was the desolation of much of this area, and so many of these houses and farms were burned, and the people felt that this was done for a political purpose to maintain the Union. Therefore, the Union should do something about paying them back. This was banging one's head against a brick wall. And it was a very frustrating experience for me, and I only for about a year was involved with that. But it was a very embittering one, because it continued to reaffirm the feeling that people were taking Reconstruction and using it as a way to punish people continually. And my third wife, Mattie Likens, had been a very strong Confederate supporter, and although she also believed in the Union, but she felt very much that these Southerners had been treated inhumanly, and she opened, as a matter of fact, an orphanage for widows and children of the Confederacy here in Kansas City. This was not a popular thing to have done, and I remember one year she'd had no contributions at all, except one man had sent her a bag of grain, and my wife had sent a bag of Christmas toys for them. So the the tearing of the fabric of society right here in Kansas City was inescapable, and one finds oneself in the very middle of it.
And you lived in the orphanage, I believe,
right.
for a time, and your friend James Sidney Rollins, and Rollins was known as the father of the University of Missouri, the president of the board of curators, and been engaged in it since the 1850s. He got you your final career position as the first professor of art at the University of Missouri.
Academic approbation at the very end. I was only required to deliver one lecture, and at that time in my life I was beginning to suffer from respiratory problems, and I wrote it, but dear Rollins, Major Rollins delivered it for me, and my health was beginning to go. The most I could say is that in my studio in Columbia, the students would at least come and watch me paint. So if I did not paint by lecture, at least I painted and taught by example. At least I hope I did.
And you told a great story, one of the classic stories in the history of art about Xenxus and Apelles in your lecture. This final moment.
The artist attempting to create art, and the Greek story, of course, was that he had painted the fruit so realistically that the flies were trying to land on the grapes. But if it was only a question of depicting truth as we see it, then the camera has solved that problem for us. Indeed, I had access to photography from the 1840s on, and sometimes people would give me photographs of their beloved departed, and I painted from those photographs. But the artist is doing more than simply recording photographically. Beauty is truth seen through the ideal. I quote Delacroix in this case, a man whose style I did not attempt to emulate, but whose passions and belief in the power of art I do believe. And so the artist always has the choice of how is he going to depict, why is he depicting it, and how does he shape his materials. This, for example, obviously, if we had simply set up a photograph in any election post, you'd have seen a collection of heads. Think of the famous photograph of the second inaugural speech of Lincoln. A great sea of faces. They tell us that John Wilkes Booth is somewhere in the crowd. Now, in this case, the artist then can lead your eye where you want to go, where he wants you to go, and tell a story in the process. And this, I think, leaves an impression on the viewer, on their hearts and their minds. And one hopes that you have then stimulated thought and feeling, and in this case, possibly even considered what their political view might be, and how they would go about executing it, teaching their children, and believing in the union and the power of the human individual to express their feelings and believe in them. Belief, so vital to what we're trying to do, and not to be dispassionate. When I think of the 80% voting for William Henry Harrison and wonder what the electorate is like now, how have we lost connection with our children and our children's children, that they do not feel this kind of huge need? I beg your pardon, I'm making a speech.
It's a good speech. A good speech. Mr. Bingham, there's a great line in that speech of yours to the university students. Artists permit themselves to be absorbed by what they love. And I love that line. And in your great painting, the Jolly Flatboatman, in the great river paintings, I'm also reminded of a line from Huck Finn, a line of Huck Finn's. Huck Finn says, "What you want on a raft above all things is for everybody to be satisfied, to feel right, and to be kind to the others." Ladies and gentlemen, early in his career, George Caleb Bingham was known as the Missouri artist. He has become, for generations since, the American artist, who absorbs us in what we love: our rivers, our commerce, our festivals, our mountains, our forests, and our cultivated fields. But most of all, in the character of our people, in the character of our friends. Ladies and gentlemen, George Caleb Bingham.
we have time for questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bingham has agreed to take a few questions from the audience. Please remember that he's 200 years old and his memory is not what it used to be. Yes, sir.
Is it true that he painted himself in every picture?
Is it true he painted himself in every picture?
Oh, goodness, no. My ego, though great, is not that great. But occasionally, you know, the artist will find, Bruegel used to do it, he'd put himself in as the observer of what is happening. And why not? Because that's part of keeping the eye open. How do we see? We are not the people who must sleep, we must be the people who are awake. So if placing myself in there as the watchdog, let us all be watchdogs. Huh? No, he had passed away at that point. This was 1857, and he had died 2 years earlier, unfortunately. And of course, I had heard that he had suffered from a terrible mental disease. Mental disease is something I got to know all too well when my second wife collapsed in various forms of dementia and in fact died at Fulton Institution Hospital because she was suffering from religious mania and believed that the Lord, oh well.
Other questions? There's a question over here.
The portraits vary depending upon the time in my life. Early on, it could be as little as $25. Later, we could go up to $35, $75. By the time we were painting wealthier portraits in the 1870s, I might be charging as much as $250. So it depended upon my position and the individuals as well. I had some friends for whom I painted for free, of course, as well. They were too close. They knew me too well. I couldn't possibly charge them.
The state of Missouri paid $3,500 for the Jackson portrait.
Yeah, for all the four.
Right, and that was probably the highest price. But the way you made money, the best money you made was the engravings off of these, which were sold for $5, $10, $15, $20.
That's right.
But thousands of them were sold. Yes, ma'am.
At the age of 50 in 1861, when you joined the Union Army as a private,
Yes.
what role did you anticipate pursuing in the military forces?
Well, as quiet a one as possible. At age 50, I knew I was hardly appropriate cannon fodder. And that was one reason why they quickly got me into trying to recruit for the Home Guard, of course. I wasn't very good at it. Remember, the city was very much torn as to whether they were going to be completely supporting the Union. Many of them did, but others had felt quite otherwise. And so depending upon who you talked to, you might have gotten a poke in the nose as well as a slap on the back. So I was very grateful when Governor Gamble suggested that I take up the Secretary of Treasury, although that was anything but a pleasurable experience either.
Other questions?
Did you know any fur traders yourself?
My father did. Fur trading was beginning to dissipate largely by the 1830s, and certainly by the time I was painting, it had dissipated substantially. But there were still Osage Indians living just a few miles to the west of Ararock, even in the 1820s. And they would come in, we would communicate with them, and they would buy and sell, of course, because they needed goods. And so the sense of communication with our past was still very much a live thing for me. It did not seem a completely fantastic fairy tale.
Immediately after the Cherokee removal, the five civilized tribes removal from Georgia in the 1830s, later in the 1830s, there were Indian removals from Missouri, which would have happened while you were still a teenager.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
How long did you live in Independence?
5 years, sir. Yeah, that's where I painted Order Number 11. I believe it is now a substantial mansion of some 26 rooms, but when I lived there, it was a 6-room farmhouse from 1865 to 1870. Mm-hmm.
We intend, by the way, to film an interview with Mr. Bingham and Kansas City Public Television at the Bingham Wagner home sometime early this summer.
Far fancier than when I lived there. Yes, sir.
Sorry.
Other than the Cumberland Gap painting, Daniel,
I was told that I painted a sign outside of Booneville, but it was of such primitive nature I'd just as soon forget it.
And there's a picture of Daniel Boone that doesn't survive on one of the political banners. There,
yes, on the political banners.
Painted a number of political banners, Harrison in 40 and Clay in 44. And those banners, at least one of those banners, included a portrait of Daniel Boone.
How did an artist in your time get your art supplies?
By St. Louis, we were beginning to get more and more brought in. Paints were being prepared somewhat ahead. But when I was just beginning, all I had was house paints that I could mix with and play with. And it was a very difficult situation. I mean, you could get linseed oil and turpentine because people use them for houses. But getting the refined colors, you had to go to a larger metropolitan area in order to obtain these. And it was not easy at the beginning, I can tell you.
St. Louis, by the 1830s, St. Louis had a number of artists and essentially an artist colony.
That's right.
Going on. Brent?
If we were to commission you to paint a picture of American life today, what would you paint?
Oh, good heavens.
Oh, what would you paint today, Mr. Bingham? Elections are still a pretty interesting subject, of course.
Perhaps the rocket. We still seem to be needing them, don't we?
Modes of transportation.
Sadly.
Yeah.
The power to destroy seems to increase too, doesn't it? That's a warning for us.
Is that lady over here towards the back?
That painting of Mrs. Sappington.
Yes.
She's flipping the bird.
Oh, no, she's not. She's wearing glasses
She's
and
holding
she's
her
holding
glasses.
her glasses.
Look carefully.
Jane Braithwaite would have been so shocked to have heard you say
You
that.
can see the actual portrait upstairs, and you will see that she's holding her glasses with that extended finger.
Good eyes, good eyes.
Back here, Steve.
Well, first of all, Mr. Bingham, just to let you know, democracy still goes on to the point that we still want to, we like to have elections, like next week we have a mayoral, and then following we have an earnings tax, so in the next 2 weeks we have 2 votes.
Amen.
But your painting, order number 11, that's my favorite, hangs in my house, a reproduction of it, and I like it because it continues what we call the border war. And that the red-legged jayhawker, the Kansas militia there, just a little note, the basketball rules are up here. My second favorite team over in Lawrence, I must admit.
Is there a question here, Steve?
But your feelings or any thoughts about the Kansas militia, was there a reason you showed them so violent as you did in the painting?
Because they were, sir. And it isn't a facetious situation. When you think that there are almost no antebellum houses standing in Kansas City, and that was the reason why. These places were burned down. I saw some of those people, those women, struggling those 28 miles to get to the river. This was not humorous, this was appalling. And for heaven's sakes, Quantrill, they knew where Quantrill's troops were. Why didn't Ewing simply take a brigade and follow them? Oh no, let's pick on the women and children and destroy their homes. Pardon me for becoming so passionate, but that kind of human suffering is so unnecessary when there's enough that goes on under the code of military honor or structure, whatever it might be, and that the civil liberties of these people were simply trampled upon. Sorry.
You might all be interested in October, or is it November? November, at the library, we're going to host a Civil War on the Borders conference in which the authors of two of the best books on this subject, Michael Feldman, who wrote Inside War, which is about the guerrilla war in Missouri, and Nicole Etchison, who wrote Bleeding Kansas, and they'll talk about this, how brutal the war really, except perhaps for Sherman's march through Georgia and a few other incidences, the war on the border from Bleeding Kansas, from the middle of the 1850s, the origins of the Civil War, through Quantrill's raid on Lawrence and to the end of the war, was most brutal. And there's even a good argument. T.J. Stiles, in his biography of Jesse James, makes this argument very, very cogently, that the Civil War in Missouri really extended through the James brothers and the rise of outlawry, bank robbery, and railroad robbery in the late 1860s and 1870s. It was a vicious part of the war here. Sir.
Is it possible for me to drive slightly less than 2 hours east of there and see the house where you once lived, looking down on the river, as you might have seen that river?
In Arrow Rock. There is a house that I actually built in 1837, which is still standing in Arrow Rock, if that's the one you mean.
Then rebuilt, but it's like you, just as if you just left it.
Well,
And Margie Conrad's mentioned at the beginning that Arrow Rock is having a Bingham Festival on April 2nd. It'd be a great time for everybody to go down and see the house. And for those of you who haven't been to Arrow Rock, it's really wonderful. It's a wonderfully, beautifully preserved antebellum community. Maybe okay, ladies and gentlemen, please thank George Caleb Bingham, Robert Gibby Brand. As always.